In this part, we'll be looking at one of the important strengthening mechanisms, that is precipitation hardening. And you will know why it is so important when we talk about strengthening in the materials. So here I have shown an image of aeroplane, and you can see the body of this aeroplane is made up of aluminum or its alloys. And if you look at this body, you can see that these are made from the precipitate hardened aluminum alloys. If you look at this microstructure more detail, you can see there are precipitates, fine precipitates, which are distributed in this aluminum matrix. These are grain boundaries and these are precipitates in it. Now let's look at the history of this precipitation hardened alloys. And it started with a work of Alfred Will. So he was a German metallurgist and who invented these alloys, that is aluminum with some percentage of copper, magnesium and manganese, which is now known as duralumin. And this alloy is extensively used in aircraft. If you want, you can read this article, which is like the discovery of strong aluminum, and you can see that how Alfred Will lead to make this duralumin alloys. So he worked extensively on aluminum alloys and he was a metallurgist, so he knew this transformation, that is gamma iron to martensite transformation via quenching. So he derived ideas from transformation of gamma iron to martensite when it is quenched, and he thought of doing the same thing with aluminum alloys. And he started quenching aluminum alloys and he found that there is no change in the microstructure or there is no increase in the hardness. So we know that when I quench gamma iron, it turns into martensite and the hardness increases tremendously. But here in this case, when he quenched aluminum alloys, there was no success in increasing hardness. Rather, in some of the cases, he found that there is a decrease in hardness. So here, when he tried to do aluminum alloys and he kept on doing it, and one fine Saturday he quenched an alloy and forgot to take hardness of those alloys, and he went for a weekend, and when he came back on Monday and tried to do hardness measurement on these alloys which were quenched on Saturday, and he found that there is an increase in the hardness. Now he thought about it. He thought that what has happened during the weekend. So he quenched some alloys and he let them be there, and he measured the hardness after some time, after a few days, and he found that there is an increase in the hardness, and that is what we called as serendipity in terms of a scientific research. So with time he found that there was an increase in the hardness, and he put hardness plot versus aging time. So he quenched alloy and with different aging time, so after 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, like that he measured hardness, and what he found was the hardness increases till certain time and starts decreasing. So we get this kind of plot, hardness versus aging time plot, in case of this aluminum, copper, magnesium alloys, and this is called as age hardening. That is, with time the hardness is increasing. And why this is happening? Because there are precipitation which is taking place in these alloys. Now I'll be looking at what are the roles of precipitates towards the strengthening or hardness of the material. So let's look at different alloys which we use now extensively, such as aluminum copper alloys, which has theta precipitates. So here we can see that the theta precipitates are at the boundaries and theta prime precipitates are at the grain interiors. We'll be seeing at what are these theta prime or theta precipitates further. And you have this aluminum lithium alloy which has Al3Li precipitate in aluminum lithium alloys, and you can see that these precipitates are distributed throughout the matrix, which increases the strength of these aluminum lithium alloys. Aluminum lithium alloys are very light alloys and they are extensively used in aerospace industries. And similarly, you can see this alloy, which is superalloy, nickel-based superalloy, which has gamma prime precipitate. So you have this gamma prime, that is Ni3L precipitate in gamma matrix. and this precipitate increases the strength of the material, and this alloys retain a strength even at high temperatures. So here you can see that these precipitates are intermetallics, and we have seen that intermetallics increases the strength of a material. So these precipitates are intermetallics, and they increases the strength or retain strength even at high temperature. So thus, understanding the role of precipitates towards the strength of an alloy becomes important. So these were some classic examples of alloys which we are using today also for certain specific applications, such as in aerospace applications, or here in this case we use the super alloys for turbine blades, which goes into turbofan and all. So let's move on and understand what is precipitation hardening. So let's understand how precipitates form first. So the precipitation hardening, the basic criteria to obtain precipitation hardening or edge hardening. Let's look that criteria. So let's have this temperature versus composition plot, and this is a phase diagram which we are going to plot, and let's consider this eutectic phase diagram. So let's mark the different phases in this phase diagram. So we have liquid here, you have alpha here, you have alpha plus beta, and you will have alpha plus liquid here in this region. So these are the different phase regimes in this phase diagram. And let's consider some composition here. Let's consider the C0 composition here, and you can see that this solvus line, this is a solvus line, and it should decrease with decreasing temperature. So here the solvus line is decreasing with decreasing temperature. What does this mean is that if I increase the temperature in this fashion, or if I increase the temperature, what I can see that the solute, that is B in A, will start increasing. So you will have more solubility of B in A when I increase the solvus, or when I move along this solvus line when I increase the temperature. Similarly, I can say that the solubility of B in A decreases when I decrease the temperature. So we will have decreasing solute solubility as the temperature decreases. This is what the solvus line indicates. Now there are three steps to form a precipitate, that is solution treatment, quenching and aging. So what we do is that we plot this time plot and see how these treatments lead to formation of precipitates. So let's consider this temperature T0. So you hit, we have considered this C0 as our composition and T0 as the temperature. So we heat this alloy to this temperature, which is in this single phase region. So we have this alpha only. So if you want to have precipitate, you have to hit that, or you have to get to a temperature where there is only a one single phase exists. So we reach to a temperature T0, and that is in this phase field, that is alpha, and you hold it for a sufficient time, that is called as a solution treatment. And now what do you get here, the microstructure? You will just have alpha in the microstructure. You have total alpha here, and this process is called as a solution treatment. Now what I do is that I quench the material. Let's say from this I have quenched to here. So let's say T1, lower temperature, which is in this region, where is a two-phase region, that is alpha plus beta. So I quench from this temperature, that is T0 to T1, and in quenching the cooling rate or the quenching rate is really high. So what you get is that because of sudden quenching, this microstructure, that is alpha, has retained over here at temperature T1, and what you can say that here the solubility of B in A is higher. So let us write that down. So here you have A with percentage of B is more here, because this was at this T0 temperature, But now here, as I quench it, I retain this alpha phase which has higher percentage of B. But in principle, if you look at this equilibrium diagram, phase diagram, you should have lower content of B. So this alpha contains a higher percentage of B, and this alpha phase is called as, which is written at this temperature, is called as supersaturated solid solution. Let me write it down. So this alpha, it is supersaturated solid solution because it is saturated more or supersaturated with B atoms in A. So this alpha contains more B atoms or more percentage of B as compared to what it has to be when it has to be in equilibrium. So I quenched it, so it contains or it retains the more percentage of B in alpha, and thus this solid solution is called as supersaturated solid solution. Now what I do is that I heat it to a temperature somewhere here and I get the precipitation of beta in this. So now here, as this was quenched, this was not a stable composition at this temperature, so it starts precipitating out beta phase here. So you get a precipitation of beta here, that fine precipitates of B, and this precipitates of B or this precipitates beta will increase the strength of this alloy. So you get this alpha beta microstructure in this way, and if I keep this for a longer time, what will happen? So these precipitates will grow. So they will grow in this fashion, their number decreases and their size increases. So you can see that their numbers have decreased here and the sizes have increased. So we get this alpha beta microstructure here, and the process of getting bigger precipitates at the components of smaller precipitates is called as Ostwald ripening. So you can read about this in more detail in some solidification books. So here in this case, what we have done, we have treated this alloy in three ways, or three treatments we have done, that is solution treatment, quenching and aging. And what we found that we went to a single phase region, we quenched from that temperature to a lower temperature which is in the two phase region, and what we achieve is a supersaturated solid solution, that is alpha here, and now we heat it to a somewhat intermediate temperature to precipitate out this beta phase from the alpha phase, and we can play with the time or temperature to make this precipitate grow larger, or we can control their fractions, and we can achieve some kind of microstructure in this way where you have larger precipitates and the number fraction decreases. And let's move ahead. So we have seen formation of these precipitates. Now let's understand what are the different stages of precipitation. So we have seen that we got alpha supersaturated solid solution, and out of that we have precipitate out beta. So there are some sequence when the precipitate forms from these supersaturated solid solutions. Let's look at that. So we have supersaturated solid solution, then there are some transition structures, and there are aged phases. Aged phases means with time and temperature you see what are the evolution of phases. So in aluminum copper alloys we have alpha, and that is, I call it a supersaturated solid solution. Then it transforms to GP zones, that is Guionier-Preston zone, and then it transforms to theta double prime, then it transforms to theta prime, and then it transforms to theta, that is an Al to Cu phase. So this is how the aluminum copper alloys, the precipitation sequence is. So you have supersaturated solid solution of alpha, and with time or with temperature you can get this kind of precipitates in aluminum copper alloys. So you have GP zones, and these are completely coherent with the matrix. So we have this alpha and you have this GP zones which are coming out. So what do I mean by completely coherent? That means there is one-to-one correspondence with the lattice parameters or these planes here. So you have there is one-to-one correspondence between lattice planes of matrix with that of precipitate. So these are GP zones, and this forms at the initial stages of precipitation. Now you have strained but coherent precipitates. So you have, there is a lattice matching here or the matches here, but these are strained. You can see these are strained. So there are strained but coherent precipitates. So these are the next stage of GP zones when they convert into theta prime, and these are strained but coherent. They are still coherent. There is correspondence between lattice spacings of matrix with that of precipitate. Now there are some incoherent precipitates. So after this, the third stage is you form an incoherent precipitate, such as you have one-to-one correspondence for some planes, and some other planes you don't have a one-to-one correspondence. So you can see that there are some kind of dislocations forming here. Let me mark that. So you can see that if I consider this plane and this plane, these are matching with the matrix planes clearly, but this plane is not matching. So you can say that there is a formation of dislocations. Let me mark that also. So you can consider this kind of dislocations here and this kind of dislocations. So you have some planes which goes with one-to-one correspondence with the matrix, and some planes here in this case they are not matching, or they are semi-coherent here. They are not completely or fully coherent with the matrix. So this kind of precipitates are called as semi-coherent precipitates, and you can see that these lines which are darker over here, these are because of the dislocation or strain dislocation which are there or needed to maintain the coherence. So you can see that the strained precipitates like this in the microscope or TEM micrograph. Now the last stage is incoherent precipitates, and you can see there is no matching of lattice spacings of precipitates with the matrix. And here in this case I would like to mention that the size of this precipitates increases in this direction. So let me write that down also. So the size of precipitates increases in this direction. So you have increase in the size of precipitates in the direction. So you have smaller sizes of GP zones, that is coherent precipitates. Then it turns into strained but coherent. Then the third stage is semi-coherent, and the fourth stage is incoherent precipitates. And we have defined based on their lattice matching, or the planes which are matching, or whether they are coherent with the matrix or not. So the size of precipitates increases and the distance between them increases. So we have seen this, when you have smaller precipitates, the size is small, the distance between them is also small. As we increase the size of the precipitates, the distance between them also increases. And in this precipitation sequence, you can see that the interface of the precipitates change. So we can see that the interface of the precipitates changes. Now, why are we studying this kind of precipitates, or what is the reason that we are interested whether precipitates are coherent or incoherent, or what are their sizes or the distance between them? Because these precipitates will act as an obstacle for dislocations, and they will interact based on their nature with the dislocations. So whether they are small or big, so they interact with dislocations differently. Whether they are coherent or incoherent, they will interact with dislocations differently. That is why we are interested to look at what is the nature of precipitate. Now let's move ahead. So as I mentioned you, this precipitate dislocation interactions. So there can be two possibilities when you have precipitate in the microstructure or in the matrix. So the matrix dislocations will interact with these precipitates, and there are two possibilities. either dislocation bypass the precipitate or dislocations pass through the precipitate, or it can call it as a shear or cut through the precipitate. So these are the two possibilities, and these possibilities depends on the nature or size of the size of the precipitates or nature of the interfaces. So let's look at these two possibilities. So one is called as a bowing of dislocations, that is nothing but a bypassing of the precipitate. So let's consider you apply a stress, you have dislocation, and let's consider these are the precipitates here. Now this dislocation comes, okay, let's understand this. So you have a dislocation which moves on the glide plane and interacts with a precipitate. Now what happens if this precipitate is hard or strong or incoherent? Let me write it down. So we have this hard, weak or incoherent precipitate. Or let's say incoherent precipitate. So when this dislocation comes or interact with such kind of precipitates, they will bow. They cannot pass through this precipitates and they start bowing around the precipitates, and they bow in this fashion because we are applying stress, and they bow in this fashion and they bow. And you can see that, let me mark a dislocation line here. So we can see that we have seen this kind of bowing when we talked about formation of loops or formation of operating of sources, dislocation sources. Now you can see that at this region it has opposite nature. So this is moving in this direction, or the tension T vector, and the T vector is in this direction. So these segments of dislocation will attract each other and they form a loop, or let us do that. So they form a loop. So we will have a loop formation here in this way, and this dislocation sets free. And now what you can see that you have this dislocation loops forming, and you have this dislocation which has bypassed. So this is one mechanism by which a dislocation bowing occurs and formation of a loops. So dislocation has bypassed these two precipitates but has left with permanent loops around it. Now if next dislocation comes, it has to bow in this way, and the distance between them is decreasing, and thus it causes more strengthening in the material. So this is a bypassing of the precipitate. Now let's look at what is shearing or pass through, the dislocation pass through the precipitate, how that mechanism occurs. Now let's say shearing of precipitates. Let's consider this dislocation, and let's consider this has to be top view. This is our dislocation, and this is a front view. So this is a glide plane or a slip plane, and this dislocation is at this glide plane. And what kind of precipitates show shearing? So dislocation can shear through two precipitates which are soft, small, or coherent. So this kind of precipitates, when they interact with dislocations, the dislocation can cut through or shear through this precipitate. So what will be the nature? What are the nature of such precipitates? The nature of such precipitates are they are soft, they are small, and they are coherent. So let's understand how this shearing takes place. So you have dislocation which comes, and then dislocation can cut through. So you can see that the dislocation has cut through, and it has created a step, or it has sheared the top part with the bottom part of this precipitate. And this step which has been created here, let's say this step, has a magnitude of Burgess vector of this dislocation. So this precipitate has sheared now. You can see that it has sheared, and you can see in 3D format it is that the top part of this precipitate has sheared as with respect to the bottom part, and this happens over this glide plane, which is this plane marked with the blue. And let's look at some TM micrographs here. So here I have shown some TM micrographs, and here you can see that there is a shearing of precipitates. Precipitate has been sheared multiple times here. And now here in this case where the dislocations cannot shear through, so they have bowed around this precipitate, and you can see that the loops which are formed around the precipitates, and you can see clearly the dislocation bowing around those precipitates and forming a dislocation loops also. So this mechanism where there is a bowing of dislocation, or when dislocation try to bypass the precipitate, there is a loop formation. This mechanism is called as Orowan looping. So this is called as Orowan loops, and this is called as Orowan looping, or simply Orowan mechanism. Or in this case, it is called as shearing mechanism. So we have two possibilities we have seen, where dislocation bypass, that is called as Orowan looping, and dislocation can cut through the precipitate, and that is called as shearing, that is this precipitate shearing. Now let's move ahead. So we have seen the nature of precipitates governs whether the dislocation can cut through them or they can bow around them. So dislocation, shearing or cutting of the precipitates, I have already mentioned, if they are small, soft and coherent. And dislocation bypassing or Orowan looping mechanism can happen when the precipitates are big, hard and incoherent. So coherent with matrix, these are small precipitates, that is GP zones. These are GP zones. We have seen the sequence of precipitates, precipitation which is happening in aluminum copper alloys, and you have GP zones which are coherent. Semi-coherent with the matrix, these are intermediate size precipitates, and incoherent with matrix, these are large precipitates. So we have seen, let me write that down also here. So we have seen this sequence, that is alpha supersaturated goes to theta double prime, sorry, not theta double prime first, it will be GP zones which are coherent. So you have GP zones, then theta double prime, then theta prime, and then theta. So we have this precipitation sequence. So I have mentioned that the size also increases here. So GP zones which has very small precipitates, so they are coherent with the matrix. As the size increases, they lose the coherency and they become incoherent with the matrix. So we have theta which is incoherent with the matrix. And thus theta, when theta precipitates are there, you have dislocation bypassing or bowing which is happening. While if there are GP, that is linear piston zones which are present, these precipitates, they are coherent and thus dislocation can cut through them. So we have seen this condition, aged condition, and we have seen this over-aged condition. In aged condition, you have this small precipitates distributed, so their number of higher, and let's mark these three parameters, that is fraction of precipitates, that is F, interparticle spacing R, interparticle spacing, let me mark that here. So what do I mean by interparticle spacing? So this is a distance between these two particles. So we can measure the distance between all these particles and average it out to find out what is an average interparticle spacing R. And precipitate size, so we can find out the sizes of this precipitate and find out what is an average size of this precipitate in this aged condition. So we have this precipitates in the alpha matrix, and now we over-aged it. So what is happening here? The sizes are increasing. So we can say that the fraction is decreasing. So we have large fractions of small precipitates. So we have the fractions is decreasing. However, the R is increasing, that is interparticle spacing is increasing. You can see clearly that if the size is increasing, the fraction will decrease and the interparticle spacing, that is R, will increase. Similarly, the precipitate size is increasing over here. So if we have R increasing, that is small r increasing, that is precipitate size is increasing, you can say that the interparticle spacing also increases. However, the fraction, number fraction decreases. Now we have seen that there will be increase in strength because of interaction of these dislocations or matrix dislocation with the precipitates. Whether it can be bypassing or shearing, both mechanism will lead to increase in the strength. And let's look at some relations of strength with the precipitate size. Let's look at what can be the increase in the strength when I consider the precipitate size. So remember, we have discussed about bowing or curved dislocations. Let me mark here what we have seen. So we have seen this relation where we wanted this dislocation to be bowed here, and we have seen that what is the stress required to maintain this curvature of this dislocation. So we have seen in case of bowing of dislocations, so we can write that tau is equal to alpha gb upon r, where r is distance between these two precipitates, where we can write this r as distance between two precipitates. We have proved this relation earlier also. So we are just using that relation, that is tau is equal to alpha gb upon r, and here I can say that when r, that is precipitate size, increases, the distance between the interparticle distance also increases. So when capital R increases, that means small r also increases. So that is, there is one-to-one correspondence. So r is directly proportional to small r, and I can write from this relation that tau, the shear stress required to bow the dislocation around precipitate, tau is inversely proportional to the precipitate size. That means if I have smaller precipitates, that means I need more stress to bow the dislocation. And if I have bigger precipitates, that means I need a smaller stress to bow the dislocation. So this is a relation for bowing of dislocations around precipitate. Now here we can see for precipitate shearing, the tau here I am writing directly. You can refer to any standard textbook for getting this relation. So this relation can be written as tau is directly proportional to square root of r. So we can say that when shear stress, when you identify a shear stress for precipitate shearing, you can say that that stress is directly proportional to the square root of precipitate size. And let's look at the computation of bowing and cutting when dislocation interacts with precipitates. So let's look at what is a transition from cutting to bowing. So we have seen this hardness versus aging time plot in the first slide itself of this class. So here we saw that the hardness was varying in this fashion. It increases till some time and it starts decreasing. So why is that happening? Because there are different precipitates, or precipitation is evolving during this time. So initially you form GP zones which are coherent, and then at this condition these are, you get theta double prime and then theta prime which are semi-coherent, and you get coherent precipitates, that is theta. And from here to theta, that is from GP zone to theta double prime to theta prime and to theta, the sizes of these precipitates are increasing. So there is an interplay of this particle size on the hardness, and we'll be looking at that. So this condition where you get a maximum hardness, that is called as a peak edge condition, and the part or the time before it is called as under edge condition, and if you keep for more time it is called as over edge condition. So this kind of behavior is also called as edge hardening. So you are getting hardness increased with respect to time, and that is why it is called as edge hardening. Now let's look at why we get this kind of curve. So we have precipitates initially like GP zones or theta double prime, which are small in size and they are coherent, and thus the dislocation can cut through. However, in this location where, or in this region or in this region of time, the precipitates increases their sizes and they become incoherent, and thus The dislocation cannot shear through them, and they bypass them by making these loops, which are Orowan loops. And this mechanism is called as Orowan mechanism. We have looked at this. Now let's plot shear stress versus precipitate diameter, and you can plot that tau is proportional to square root of r, and you get this behavior. The shear stress varies with r in this fashion. And for Orowan mechanism, the tau is inversely proportional to r, and the shear stress varies in this fashion. Now here you can say that this is a critical radius where which we get the maximum shear stress, or we have to apply a maximum shear stress. So here in this case, at this region, the stress required for Orowan looping or Orowan mechanism is higher than the stress required for a cutting mechanism. Thus, in this region, the precipitates will get sheared, or the dislocation can cut through the precipitate. While here in this region, that is precipitates more than this critical radius, in this region you have cutting of the precipitates require more stress as compared to bowing or Orowan mechanism. That is why dislocation will both or operate using Orowan mechanism in this region, which has a radius, or of the precipitates which has a radius more than the critical radius here. And thus, if I see here, I have a shearing mechanism, and here I have a bypassing mechanism. And if I plot a net of these two effects, you can see that it varies in this way, where I need the shear stress which varies with the precipitate radius in this fashion. And that is why we get this nature. Like you can see now, you can appreciate why we get this kind of nature of hardness with aging time, because you have transition from cutting to bowing mechanisms which is happening, and thus we can see that the increase in strength happens at different sizes of the precipitates. If you want to get a maximum strengthening in the material, you should go for this kind of precipitates which is having the radius equal to RC here. So you'll get the maximum strengthening here. Now let's look at some points here. So we have seen that the stress required to shear precipitate increases due to increase in size. We have seen that here, that as the size increases from GP zones to theta, the stress required to shear precipitate increases. Okay, so we can see that the shear stress required to shear the precipitate is increasing with increasing the size. After the size reaches a critical radius RC, the stress required for bowing is lower than the shearing the precipitate. So stress decreases. So here in this case, the stress required for bowing is lower than the stress required for shearing, and thus the stress decreases. So you can see that the stress is decreasing here. Here also we have plotted the net value, so the stress has decreased here. At peak edge, the maximum hardness is obtained. So at this edge, at this point, or at this peak edge condition, you get a maximum hardness. Overaging leads to coarsening of precipitate. If I overage it, there will be coarsening of precipitates, and thus there will be a bowing mechanism which operates, and thus which decreases the stress as compared to the shearing mechanism. So this was a precipitation hardening which we have looked at, and we have seen what are the different mechanisms that can operate, such as shearing and bypassing of precipitates, and what are their roles towards the hardness or shear stress. We have also seen how the hardness varies with respect to time and nature of precipitates, the interfaces of the precipitate and matrix, and how they play the role to control hardness of the matrix. This is what we have seen. Now I'll be moving on to next part, which is a dispersion hardening. Before that, I would like you to find out what is an effect of temperature. We have seen an effect of time here, but I would like you to find out what is an effect of temperature on this behavior. So here, when we are discussing about precipitation hardening, let me introduce dispersion hardening to you, or dispersion strengthening. So in dispersion strengthening, the mechanisms are more or less same as that of precipitation hardening. But in dispersion hardening, we incorporate hard insoluble second phase in soft metallic matrix. So these are foreign particles which we introduce. Precipitates are formed during the process itself. So that is out of the matrix. But here we incorporate hard particles from outside. So let's consider this, that is a case of dispersion strengthened metals, and there are like particle reinforced metallic composites. So here in dispersion strengthened metals, we use very small fraction of dispersoids, that is 3 to 4%. But these small fractions are hard particles and they act as a obstacle for dislocation motion. While in composite, that is particle reinforced metallic composites, this gives a composite effect and to achieve high stiffness. In this case, which are now we are talking about dispersion strengthening, we are interested in to stop or put a barrier for dislocation motions, and thus the interaction of dislocation with these particles is more or less similar to that of what we have seen with precipitation hardening. The important thing here which I want to show in this figure is that here you have this precipitation hardened alloy, that is incoherent 792, which is this alloy, and this is Mar alloy. These are all precipitation strengthened alloys, and this is thoria dispersed nickel. So you have this thoria dispersed nickel. So you put these hardened thoria particles not more than 3 to 4% in nickel and see how the strength is varying with respect to temperature. Now if you see precipitation hardened alloys, they start decreasing their strength as we go on increasing the temperature, and they will reach to a point where their strength drastically drops. While this thoria dispersed nickel, the strength is decreasing, but not to that extent what we have seen for a precipitation hardened alloys. So it retains its strength with high temperature. So why is this happening? Because at higher temperatures in precipitation hardened alloys, these precipitates will start dissolving in the matrix again, and thus they lose the strength. So let me draw this eutectic diagram and explain it to you. So let's say we are here, and if we start increasing the temperature, so we cannot use precipitation hardened alloys after this temperature. Let's say for this composition. After this composition, these precipitates will start dissolving, and thus they lose the strength. However, these dispersions or dispersoids, hard particles in this soft metallic matrix, will not dissolve or they will not lose their strength, and thus the thoria dispersed nickel or dispersion strengthening helps to retain higher strength at high temperatures, and that's an advantage over precipitation hardened alloys. And with this I will stop here.